computer. So, hello, Chris Gunness. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with me today. I know you've been very busy recently, so welcome.
It's a pleasure, Peter. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much for asking me. I'm very grateful to be here.
Chris, I'm hoping that you can give us some of your insight. There's been this very severe allegations made against UNRWA now by the Canadian Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, and they're taking a court case to complain about the Canadian government funding UNRWA. And they make a number of allegations. But before I get into the specific allegations they make, I have their court submission here. Just remind the audience, if you wouldn't mind, what UNRWA does, why it's important.
It's important to think of UNRWA as a quasi-government rather than as an aid organization because of the sheer scale of what UNRWA does. UNRWA provides an education for over 500,000 children every day across the Middle East in Syria, Jordan, West Bank, Gaza, and Lebanon. UNRWA's primary health clinics have 7 million patient visits a year. UNRWA in Gaza before the war was distributing food to 1.2 million people. So through the decades, and UNRWA became operational on the ground on May the 1st, 1950. So for nearly 75 years, UNRWA has been providing these human development and emergency services, which frankly are a stabilizing influence. So foreign ministers and presidents and prime ministers and government ministers at all levels have praised UNRWA for providing stability through giving the next generation in the Middle East a sense of hope, a sense of a belief in a prosperous future. It gives millions of people a healthy life, a long and healthy life. So UNRWA provides not just food and medicine and social security, but hope and a belief in a stable, prosperous and peaceful future. And right now, with the Middle East on the edge, I think that's a really important contribution.
Thank you. Let me go through some of the specific allegations in this submission. I'll start off with the overall attempt seems to be to equate UNRWA with Hamas or show that they're acting in tandem. And one of the strong allegations is that a deputy commissioner of UNRWA, a person named Lenny Stenseth, met with Hamas, and apparently according to this deposition, at the meeting, that person affirmed her solidarity with Hamas on behalf of UNRWA. What do you think?
I think that there has to be evidence, because if the source of this deposition, this submission to Canadian court, is articles in the New York Times, I don't think any judge in their right mind is going to take that seriously. There has to be proper evidence. When was this said? Who was there? Who were the witnesses? Who is going to come to court and say, yes, I heard this person in UNRWA say that? And let us also be clear that under the late Secretary General Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General at the time of the 2006 general election in Palestine, when Hamas won its overwhelming victory in the elections on the 30th of January, Mr. Annan came out and said that the contact policy with Hamas is as follows. UNRWA and other UN agencies can have contact with Hamas up to and including a ministerial level, and I presume that means a prime ministerial level, in order to discuss the implementation of humanitarian mandates. But political contacts were absolutely out of the question. So, and that makes sense at every level. If UNRWA is going to be delivering, let's say, pharmaceuticals to a hospital, it has to phone up possibly even the health minister, who is likely to be a Hamas appointment, but also the director of the hospital, the person who puts on the cold storage unit. You know, every level, the person on the gate has got to be told the UNRWA trucks are arriving. So it makes perfect sense when you're dealing with the de facto authorities, which UNRWA does in all of the 5 areas it works, for UNRWA to have contact with the de facto authorities, and there's a properly implemented UN contact policy. So it's perfectly possible that UN officials have been meeting Hamas. I'm sure that's not been the case since the 7th of October, and that is entirely legal. If there's real evidence that that specific phrase was used, I'd like to see what that evidence is, because I think most Canadian judges will look at that and say, you've got to be serious. I mean, you know, what is the real evidence? But generally speaking, contact is allowed, and that is a directive that comes down from the highest levels in the UN, the Secretary General's office.
Okay, that's pretty clear. There's another allegation that is repeated here that's been floated around often, and basically, I'm quoting from the submission. For years, UNRWA teachers have been using textbooks to teach Palestinian children to hate and kill Jews. I'm sure you've heard that many times before, but just give us your short response on that.
The short response is that wherever any UN agency works, it uses the textbooks of the host authorities. So if there was, say, a UN organization in Canada preparing children for public exams in Canada, it's perfectly logical that it would use Canadian textbooks. Now, that is true of UNRWA. In the West Bank and Gaza, it uses the Palestinian Authorities Education Ministry textbooks. And in Syria, it uses Syrian textbooks because it's preparing children for Palestinian exams in the OPT or Syrian exams in Syria. Now, the textbook issue is a difficult one because it's a sovereignty issue. If someone turned up in Canada and says, "Oh, I don't like the way you describe Canada's treatment of the indigenous population or whatever," you would turn around and say, "Well, hang on, it's not for an outsider to tell us. We have our own human rights organizations, we have our parents' committees, our educationalists, our own education department." And so it is with Palestine. It is a sovereignty issue. But what UNRWA has done, it's gone beyond the extra mile for peace, as it were. It reviews all of the textbooks which are used in UNRWA schools. And this was the case when I was in UNRWA anyway, UNRWA would review all the textbooks and it would assess these textbooks on 3 criteria: age appropriateness, gender depictions to make sure that women and men are fairly represented, and political objectivity. And only 3 to 4% of materials are found to be problematic. And generally, political neutrality is not the most common. But where there are issues, the teachers are given alternative materials. They're given special training so when they come to that particular part of the textbook, geography, grade 2, term 6, lesson 5, whatever it may be, they have a different way of teaching that to make sure that their teaching in the classroom accords with UN standards and UN practices and human rights and all of those frameworks that the UN uses in terms of all of its human development work. And that's been going on in UNRWA in partnership with the donors, including Canada, for years. And UNRWA, is the most heavily audited organization in the UN. And let me tell you, and Canada has been perfectly happy to audit UNRWA and to continue funding UNRWA. So I don't know what evidence these lawyers have, but certainly hitherto, the processes and the frameworks that have been in place have satisfied the stringent standards of the Canadian government.
Let me go with another one. I'm not going to push back on it. I guess that's a complete answer. I have talked to in Gaza and elsewhere to UNRWA teachers, for example, and they say one of the things is that, of course, Palestinians talk about returning. They talk about their families coming from Haifa and their family coming from Tel Aviv and so on. And Israel finds that very threatening and portrays that as if it were anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish. And so it's part of...
the right of return is a universal right enshrined in the Universal Declaration. So if a Canadian is somewhere else in the world, that Canadian has a right to go back to Canada, and Palestinians are no different, just as Israelis and Jews are no different. They have the right of return to Israel. Well, you can't have the right of return to Israel but deny it to all Palestinians.
Right. What about the allegation, I'm quoting again from their submission, that Hamas terror tunnels have been located under or next to UNRWA facilities?
Well, to be clear, UNRWA is responsible for what happens in its installations. So even in refugee camps, UNRWA is an aid organization, does not have a police force, it does not have an army. It can't walk into a refugee camp and disarm people. It can't forbid people from digging tunnels, especially those who've been blockaded and who've been subjected to all sorts of attacks through the decades. But UNRWA is responsible for neutrality in its own installations. And there have been examples of where UNRWA has found tunnels underneath its installations. It happened once when I was working in UNRWA, and it happened again during the war. And guess what UNRWA did? It went to the donors and it went to the Israelis and it said, we've found these tunnels. Our engineers are blocking them off. We'll do everything we can to make sure that even the ground underneath our installations are neutral. But UNRWA isn't responsible for what happens underneath its installations. It doesn't have heat-seeking equipment that can work out what's happening. And one of the tunnels, I understand, was 80 meters underneath an UNRWA installation. How can a humanitarian organization be responsible for what's going on 80 meters below its installation? I mean, it's just an unfair allegation. UNRWA always investigates where there is credible information. And as I say, where tunnels have been found, much to the chagrin of the de facto authorities, UNRWA has notified all of its donors. We've notified the Israelis. And generally what happens when UNRWA has notified the Israelis about these allegations is, instead of being grateful that these are being notified, Israel will often turn around, as happened when I was working in UNRWA, and accuse UNRWA of collaboration with terrorists. So frankly, the agency can't win whatever it does, but to be clear, it does implement a policy of the highest levels of neutrality, even in a place like Gaza, where, you know, it's been under blockade since 2007, and there have been waves of attacks in which innocent people have been killed. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. And it's little surprise when there are so many air attacks that people, even an organization which is a proscribed terrorist organization in many countries, will attempt to build an underground network, because, you know, what else are they supposed to do? And I'm not an apologist for it. To be clear, I and many other UN officials and former UN officials have condemned absolutely the attacks on September the 7th, and on October the 7th, and UNRWA and others have condemned all violations of international humanitarian law, both by Hamas and by the IDF. So that I'm not an apologist for Hamas, and I'm making no excuse for tunnels being...
I'll just quote from what they say here, because this is very much the topic you're talking about. During this attack, we're talking about October 7th. During this attack, Hamas terrorists brutally beat, tortured, raped, and murdered men, women, and children. But Hamas did not carry out these attacks alone. Rather, they were financed and aided by UNRWA for a number of, yeah, that's it. So
Well, isn't it interesting, Peter? Isn't it interesting that, first of all, this dossier was produced on the 27th of January, which was the day after the International Court of Justice issued its provisional measures against Israel, effectively saying that there was a plausible genocide case to be answered. And for me, that was a piece of news management. It was splashed across the front page of the New York Times. Most other organizations, news outlets, such as Sky News...
You're not talking about this dossier. You're talking about the announcement by Israel.
No, the dossier was handed over to the New York Times.
Yeah, right. Okay.
You know, journalists, I believe, like Patrick Kingsley, who was one of the journalists of the New York Times in Jerusalem, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying he saw it and he wrote about it. So yes, the dossier was never handed over to UNRWA by the Israelis, by the way, but it was handed over to the New York Times. And it was a long list of allegations and a list of 12 UNRWA staff with no actual evidence. And interestingly, to this day, no evidence has been produced. So the UN set up two investigations. One was an internal OIOS, the Office of Internal Oversight, which is the highest investigative office in the UN system. The other, actually, let me correct myself, not set up by the UN, but an independent investigation, which is headed by a former French Foreign Minister, Colonna, and her investigation is due to be finalized, I think, in the middle of April, coming up quite soon. And the OIOS report, the UN report, is actually, I think, coming out quite soon. But an interim report to the Secretary General by the OIOS report, by the Office of Internal Oversight, was made. And on the strength of that, they found absolutely no evidence to support Israel's allegations. The European Union, the Australians, the Canadians, I believe, and others resume their funding to UNRWA because there simply is no evidence that's been produced. And Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State himself, has said that the US has been unable independently to confirm these allegations. And indeed, a US intelligence assessment said that there was low probability of this dossier being having credible allegations against UNRWA. So it's been largely discredited. And can I say, and I'm living experience of this, whenever Israel thought it had evidence against UNRWA, for example, during the 2014 war, Mark Regev and other spokespeople would tell journalists, well, we had to attack that UNRWA school because there were militants in it. And journalists would literally phone me up and say, Mark Regev has just told us there are militants inside your school. And actually, after the Gaza war in 2014, when these were investigated in a board of inquiry, they were found to be baseless. So, the dodgy dossier, as I call it, is turning out to be dodgy, to put it mildly, and there has been no evidence produced to suggest that the allegations that Israel has made are indeed true.
In that case, Chris, I'll take. I'm inclined to accept what you say, but what would explain then Israel's dogged determination to come after UNRWA? And this hasn't started now. I mean,
No.
Israel has been after UNRWA for a long time and would like to see it hamstrung or abolished or whatever. Why? What's
well, there was a very interesting document that was leaked in December, January time, which was an official Israeli document, a government document, which was a three-phased campaign against UNRWA: smear and delegitimize, defund, phase 2, and dismantle, phase 3. And what we've been discussing, the lies and the false allegations, that's very much part of phase 1. And as I say, the news management has failed. The donors are now coming back, including Canada, and the embarrassment, frankly, is starting. So the Americans have now passed legislation forbidding funding of UNRWA until March next year at the very earliest, but they've done it on no evidence whatsoever. And these organizations like UN Watch and others who've supported these false allegations, I hope, are now duly embarrassed because they were so quick to condemn UNRWA and publicly support this dossier, and yet their support has been shown to be ill-founded. There is no evidence that's been produced. But we're now got into the dismantle phase, and what the Israelis are trying to do is block UNRWA from functioning inside Gaza. And to answer your question, this is because they believe that if you get rid of UNRWA, then you get rid of the refugees. And if you get rid of the refugees, you get rid of the right of return of 5.9 million people, which is the number of registered refugees that UNRWA has today. But of course, that's a false narrative, because first of all, that's a bit like saying that if you get rid of Oxfam, you get rid of poor people. It's a ridiculous supposition. If you get rid of UNRWA, these remain people with inalienable rights. And those rights include the full gamut of rights that UNRWA is part of implementing: the right to education, the right to health, the right to a decent standard of living. So it's really not true to say that if you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the right of return. And in any case, if UNRWA disappeared this morning, these people would have all of the rights that refugees have. And classically, in terms of how their plight is resolved, refugees have 3 choices: local integration, where they are. So if the Syrian government or the Jordanian government were to say, yes, we'll give you passports, and well, that's fine. If the refugees of their own free volition choose that, well, that's fine. That's choice number 1. Choice number 2 is third country repatriation. So Canada wants to be generous and say we'll have 5.9 million refugees in Canada. Well, that's great. They can all go to Canada. Good luck. They'll have, no doubt, contribute very fully to your economy. Palestinians are very well qualified people. They'll, contribute, I'm sure, very fully to your economy. Or they have the right of return. And that's a choice which refugees have. Now, Resolution 194, which was passed by the General Assembly, makes it clear that all the refugees, that all the Palestinians have the right of return. It's a right which everybody has. As I say, it's embodied in the Universal Declaration. And to be clear, part of the narrative from the sort of Israeli far right is that get rid of UNRWA and hand the refugees over to UNHCR, the other refugee agency in the UN system, because UNHCR does, it does third country resettlement. That's actually not true. UNHCR does do certain resettlements, but the preferred remedy, as they call it, durable solution for refugees in UNHCR is the right of return. Why? Because in their long history of dealing with refugees, they have found that the most stable and peaceful and durable outcome follows the right to return. When people who've been at war return, live side by side with their neighbors, get on, intermarry, fall in love with each other, trade with each other, do the things that returning refugees do. That produces the most stable outcome. Now, whether that's possible or not, I don't know, but we have to see. Events since the 7th of October don't give grounds for hope. But I think the other important thing to say is that that UNRWA is not the problem. It's often said that UNRWA perpetuates the refugee problem. No, what perpetuates the refugee problem is the failure of the parties to resolve the plight of the refugees in the context of a two-state solution. So all internationally accepted paradigms for resolving the refugee crisis say that the parties to the conflict, and that's not just the Israel-Palestine conflict, in any conflict resolution, the parties decide what's going to happen about refugees. It happened in Cambodia, it happened in Afghanistan, it happens in almost all peace agreements. And it's the failure of the parties, the Palestinians and the Israelis, to agree on what happens to the Palestine refugees that perpetuates this crisis, not a UN agency which is mandated to do human development.
The part that I find, it's not clear to me, unconvincing, is that I think the Israelis know all that. They know actually that getting rid of UNRWA will not solve the refugee problem. All the things that you said, I think, are true, but they have smart analysts and intelligence. So what are they trying to do? How do they think this is going to move things ahead for them? Or is it just out of blind rage and visceral kind of hostility that they're doing it?
Well, I think the far-right government in Israel thinks that it can clear Gaza. So it will either, three choices, either bomb the Rafah crossing, bomb it open, and militarily just threaten these people to shoot them dead or whatever, and they will just run through the hole in the fence, which the Israelis blast into the Sinai, to the Egyptian side. I think both the Egyptians and the Americans have made it clear that that is unacceptable. But who knows what Israel might do. The second choice in Gaza is for them to make Gaza uninhabitable, so de-develop it. So, you've seen all the food production plants completely flattened. You've seen the agricultural base, the olive groves, the orange groves that were once in the north of Gaza, bulldozed by Israeli armored bulldozers. We've seen all the universities in Gaza completely destroyed. We've seen many cultural centers, poets, academics killed. So, the Gazan economy has been destroyed. There's over 80% unemployment. So, maybe that's the second choice Israel has, of just de-develop Gaza and make life so unbearable there that people just have to leave because they'll starve if they stay there. And we've already seen that policy to some extent being implemented. These aren't three distinct choices, but the third choice is basically kill them, do a genocide, and to some extent, all three policies are kind of possible and going on. We're seeing people, paying lots of money, $5,000 per person, to escape from Gaza and go into Cairo to a life of illegality in Egypt. But at least it gets you away from the killing fields, and it means you and your family don't get butchered. But we're also seeing, I think, as I say, the de-development of Gaza and life becoming unbearable. But either way, I think a lot of the far right in Israel believe that they're going to get Gaza back. And I think ultimately they want Gaza and the West Bank back. I think it's Gaza today, and I think they'll turn their attention to the West Bank because they want, from the river to the sea. You don't have to believe me. They say it in their speeches. They say it in the public discourse. So, I think ultimately what some in Israel want to do is reclaim all of the territory from the river to the sea. When the Palestinians say it, it's anti-Semitic, it's genocidal, it's Nazi,
and they see UNRWA as an obstacle to that project.
Well, yes, I mean, you can't have an aid organization delivering all these services, etc. If you've reclaimed all the land and you've got the Palestinians where you want them, you get rid of UNRWA, push them out, and then they're free to deal with the Palestinians however they wish. So that would be one very far right explanation of why Israel would like to see the end of UNRWA, because ultimately they want to see the end of the Palestinian presence in Gaza as a separate political entity. They just want everything between the river and the sea.
Well, Chris, thank you for answering those questions. I think it's disgraceful, this suit, and we'll see what happens. I don't actually believe that the legal effort will go very far, but it is an effort to delegitimize UNRWA. And thank you for responding to some of those questions.
It's a pleasure anytime, and let's hope this case fails and that Canadian justice does the right thing and is hopefully your courts are independent, free from political influence. And, you know, to be clear, there's a counter case to be made, which is that, you know, not funding UNRWA at a time when the ICJ has made it clear that restrictions on humanitarian aid would make a government complicit in genocide. I think the legal arguments on the other side to make sure that there's consistent Canadian funding for UNRWA by far outweigh the sorts of arguments which are made in this legal submission.
So if I got you, you're saying that were Canada to once again reverse and not fund UNRWA, it would be potentially at risk of
yes,
in face of the International Court of Justice.
Yes, so this week we've got Nicaragua taking Germany to the ICJ and arguing that it's complicit in genocide. One element is the arms sales, and the other element is the defunding of UNRWA. So the Nicaraguans are saying that the Germans are complicit in genocide by defunding UNRWA because it's been very clear in two sets of provisional measures that the defunding of UNRWA is a violation, that it's a restriction of humanitarian aid.
Right.
And I think governments which defund need to be very careful that they don't find themselves to be accused of being in violation of the Genocide Convention, because certainly that's an accusation that has been made at the ICJ in The Hague as I speak. It's being that submission is being heard today and tomorrow.
Chris Gunness, former senior executive with UNRWA, and now taking up the cudgel again in this very desperate time. Thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us.
Thanks, Peter. It's a pleasure.